Welcome to the Research Methodology section. My name is Tracey Naidu, and today I will be discussing data collection. The data collection process is largely dependent on the research instrument, which is in turn dependent on your research approach. Ideally, your research instrument should have been developed at the research proposal phase. However, in the event of changes to the study objectives and resultantly the literature review, you need to ensure that the research instrument is adjusted accordingly. There are several measuring instruments that can be used by the researcher to collect data. Therefore, the discussion under data collection should illustrate why a particular instrument was chosen over others and their appropriateness to the study. The most common used research instruments by MBA students are questionnaires and personal interviews. Before exploring the finer details in regards to questionnaires and interviews, I would like to start by discussing qualitative and quantitative research approaches and their implications on the choice of data collection instrument. Qualitative approaches aim to address the how and why of a particular phenomena and tend to use unstructured methods of data collection to fully explore the topic. As a result, qualitative questions are open-ended. For example, why do customers prefer Nescafe coffee compared to other brands? Or, how do staff feel about the high turnover rate at Company X? Qualitative methods may include open-ended questionnaires, focus groups, or interviews. Quantitative approaches, on the other hand, address the what of a certain phenomena. They use a systematic, standardized approach and employ methods such as questionnaires. Questions such as, what are the components of the current staff retention strategy? Or, what skills do managers need to implement a new corporate strategy effectively, are posed. Both approaches, qualitative and quantitative, have their strengths and their weaknesses. As the researcher, you will need to carefully select your data collection instrument in accordance with the research approach and your study aims. Let us now discuss surveys and interviews in detail. Firstly, questionnaires. Questionnaires are a good way of gathering a large amount of data and can be administered in different ways. These may include, for example, email, intranet portals, specialist survey websites, and applications such as SurveyMonkey. Telephonic administration is also possible, as is the administration via mail or face-to-face. The benefits of questionnaires are that they have a wide reach, are relatively cheap to administer, your questions are standardized, and the anonymity of your respondents can be maintained. They do, however, have certain limitations, which include a low response rate as compared to the interviews. They are unable to investigate issues to any great depth. They require that the target group is literate, and they do not allow for any direct observation. In addition, because questionnaires are usually self-administered, there is a possibility that responses may be biased, particularly if the issues involved are sensitive or require some measure of disclosure by the participant. If questionnaires are chosen for data collection, careful attention must be given to the design of the questionnaire. If possible, consider the possibility of adapting an existing questionnaire which has already been tested for reliability and validity. If you'd opt to design your own survey, it is necessary to pilot test the survey on a sample of your target group. This is to ensure that the instrument is measuring what it intends to measure and is actually appropriate for the target group. Ultimately, the data that is gathered via the instrument must enable you as the researcher to achieve your research aim and objectives. Mancosa recommends a sample size of 10 respondents for the piloting of the questionnaire. Importantly, these 10 respondents should be independent from your final study sample. Questionnaires may comprise of open-ended or closed-ended questions. For a quantitative study, the questionnaire usually comprises of closed-ended questions. These are usually presented as a series of statements in conjunction with a 5-point Likert scale. The use of Likert scales is most applicable when assessing the attitudes or perceptions of respondents. In most instances, students choose the following response scale: strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. For a qualitative study, on the other hand, the instrument comprises of a series of open-ended questions which are of a probing nature. These allow for a wider range of responses which are not predetermined. It is important to note that if your study is quantitative in nature, open-ended questions may be used but should be kept to a minimal. This type of open-ended questions should not yield thick qualitative responses. Rather, the responses to the open-ended questions should be analyzed in a quantitative manner. Now let us go on to discuss personal interviews. Personal interviews are generally used to yield rich, raw data of a qualitative nature. As such, it is not appropriate for quantitative studies. Interviews can be conducted face-to-face or by telephone. They can range from in-depth, semi-structured to unstructured, depending on the information being sought. The advantages of face-to-face interviews are that detailed questions can be asked. Further probing can be done to provide rich data. Non-verbal data can be collected through direct observation. Complex and unknown issues can be explored. Response rates are usually higher than that of self-administered questionnaires. The disadvantages of face-to-face interviews are that they are expensive and time-consuming. Interviewers may require training. They are prone to interviewer bias and interpreter bias if interpreters are used. Respondents may not be as candid as they would be for a self-administered instrument. And finally, addressing issues of a sensitive nature may prove to be quite challenging. Telephone interviews, in comparison, are advantageous as they are cheaper than face-to-face interviews, and they use less resources as well. The disadvantages of telephone interviews, however, are that they may entail having to make repeated calls, as calls may not necessarily be answered the first time. There is the risk of potential bias if callbacks are not made. It is only suitable for short interviews, and it is only accessible to the population with access to a telephone. Although questionnaires and interviews are the most commonly used instruments in MBA research, the use of focus groups may also be considered. Focus groups, also known as group discussions, are useful to further explore a topic, providing a broader understanding of why the target group may behave or think in a particular way, and assist in determining the reasons for certain attitudes and beliefs. They are usually conducted with a small sample of the target group and are used to stimulate discussion and gain greater insights. Before committing oneself to this method of data collection, it is important to note the limitations of this approach. These include the lack of privacy and anonymity, having to carefully balance the group to ensure they are culturally and gender appropriate, the potential for the risk of groupthink, in other words, not allowing for the attitudes and beliefs of others, the potential for the group to be dominated by one or two people, and finally, it is often time-consuming to conduct and can be rather difficult to analyze. If focus groups are chosen, you will need to ensure that as the discussion leader, you are able to manage conflict within the group, that you are able to draw out passive participants, and can successfully create a relaxed and welcoming environment. Having discussed the different kinds of research instruments, let us now look at how you will incorporate this information in your actual dissertation. To begin, you will need to make reference to the research instrument used in your study. Discuss the factors which were taken into consideration when choosing the instrument. In other words, what are the benefits of the chosen instrument and why was it most appropriate for your study? You will then need to allude to the construction of the research instrument. If a questionnaire has been used as a data collection instrument, state the number of questions included in the questionnaire. Usually, this should be 20 to 25 questions in total, including your demographic section. Next, mention the question categories. These are usually aligned to your study objectives. If a rating scale has been used, you will need to make reference to it. If interviews have been used as the data collection instrument, you will need to discuss why you have selected the interview method and the exact type of interviews conducted. There are typically 3 types of interviews: unstructured interviews, where there are no predetermined questions and the interview is quite adaptable; structured interviews, where there is a set of predetermined questions to provide focus. However, there is still a large degree of freedom and adaptability in getting information. And finally, we have the standardized open-ended interview, where the same open-ended questions are posed uniformly to all interviewees. Once you have discussed the instrument construction, the next step is to highlight how the instruments were administered to respondents. In the case of questionnaires, were they posted, administered telephonically, administered face-to-face, or administered via electronic means? Remember, each of these methods have both advantages and disadvantages. You will therefore need to highlight the reasons that propagated the choice of administration method. Also, you will need to justify why it was the best possible option. In the case of personal interviews, again, you will need to specify how the interviews were conducted, that is, face-to-face or telephonically. You may also elaborate on the research setting, which is the area in which the interviews were conducted. For example, you may have conducted face-to-face interviews at a coffee shop or in a boardroom at the office. Finally, with particular reference to questionnaires, you will need to discuss the collection of the questionnaires. Here you will need to allude to specific time frames. How long did it take for the surveys to be returned? Also discuss the response rate. You will need to consider the following issues. How many surveys did you administer in total? And how many of these surveys were returned? If the response rate was low, what action did you take to improve the response rate? Finally, specify the data collection points and indicate how the completed surveys were stored, paying special heed to ethical considerations. This brings us to the end of the data collection presentation. Thank you for joining me, and best of luck with the data collection process.